The first Kingkiller Chronicles book, The Name of the Wind, was a book I nearly didn't finish because of some of the major issues it had. If you saw my review on it, you'll know that I had a major issue with the character progression in the story. But I decided to give the second book a try, and now I'm in a very difficult situation with Patrick Rothfus. You see, the second Kingkiller Chronicles novel, The Wise Man's Fear, didn't necessarily fix all the issues I had with it, but it helped provide me with an important insight I never had about books and the fantasy genre before. Patrick Rothfus somehow made me hate and love his work at the same time, and for that I have to respect the guy. Now, for reviews on second and later books, I would normally do it with spoilers as opposed to first books that I will do spoiler free. The reason for this is because most people who haven't read the first book will look for a spoiler-free review. After reading the first book, you'll basically know whether or not you're interested in picking up the second book, and thus don't really need a spoiler-free review for it. But with how divisive the first book in this trilogy is and how easy it could be for someone to pick up the second book or just drop it altogether, I have to assume there will be people looking for a spoiler-free review on it. And I bet this won't be the first time something like this happens. So as a compromise, I will give you a quick overview of my scoring for the book to indicate whether or not it's worth reading. I'll keep it brief and completely spoiler free. Then for the latter part of the video, we'll enter more spoiler heavy territory. Don't worry though, I will give you ample warning when we reach that part of the video. And if this format works for this video, I may just use it in future videos of this nature. Review. So on this review chart that I'm showing on the screen right now, you'll see the scores I gave the books based on my usual criteria for reviewing a book. We have character, plot, world building, magic, and structure respectively, as well as an overall score for the book in its entirety. You'll notice for character I gave it a 6, the lowest score on the chart. This is because I didn't really see much improvement with how the characters are handled in this book compared to the second. Kvothe still feels a bit flat to me, and women are treated even worse in this book than the first. However, Rothfus does get enough right here to avoid a drop further than that. And it's more than I gave the characters in the first book too, so it is at least a bit better. Plot gets a 7, which is on par with the first book, since it still follows a plot I cared about a fair amount, despite my issues with the characters. However, it didn't necessarily improve on the plot from the first book from a technical level. World building gets a solid 8 this time around, and the improvement is basically due to how much of the wider world we get to see. We explore more places, meet more people, and interact with more cultures. So the world building develops well on top of what was already established. The magic in Wise Man's Fear is also improved on compared to the first book. It managed to build on top of the first book's premises, and we get to see a natural progression from what we've already learned. For the proper progression, I had to give it an 8 out of 10. The Wise Man's Fear's structure is on par with the first book, and in both books I've given it an 8. Rothfus knows how to structure and pace a book well with absolutely gorgeous prose. This is clearly one of his strengths as a writer. So as you can see, The Wise Man's Fear improves well on or stays on par with all the different aspects in The Name of the Wind. So overall, it's definitely improved in terms of a reader's experience. For that, I gave it an overall score of 7.4 out of 10. And compared to the first book's overall score of 6.2, I'd say it's a marked improvement. Further discussion. So this section will deal with further discussion on the book and will have some spoilers, though I will try to avoid any major plot points. So if you consider actually reading the second book and don't want to be spoiled on a single thing before doing so, I would recommend proceeding with caution. So I had some pretty strong negative feelings toward the Kingkiller Chronicles after the first book, and even 3/4 of the way into the second book. But only after finishing the second book and allowing it time to sink in did I really start to change my views. The primary reason is that The Wise Man's Fear improved on almost all aspects compared to Name of the Wind. You can tell that Rothfus absolutely improved as an author between the two, and that everything he introduced to us in the first book gets adequately expanded on in the second book. Now, don't get me wrong, it still has its flaws. The fact that it feels like we have yet to make any major strides to the main conflict of the overarching story is a major problem. We're no closer to the Chandrian, nor are we to the actual king killing than we were in the first book. We spend a lot of time in Vintas for Quoth to improve his financial standing, and a lot of time with the Ademre for Quoth to become a better warrior. I know I'm butchering the names, please ignore it. And the whole bandit subplot is clearly for his growth as a leader and an arcanist, but serves no real plot development. But that's the main gripe I have, that and the fact that the characters still feel stunted, but I have a better understanding of it now. Overall, things have improved from the first book, and I now see genuine potential for the final book in the trilogy. And speaking of the characters, let's examine why I've become more lenient with Rothfus this time around. So, it's no secret that a lot of people take issue with how Rothfus writes women in his books. Often they're very two-dimensional and have no real purpose in the plot other than to stroke Quoth's ego. The primary exception would have been Vachette, since she teaches him how to fight, but he ends up sleeping with her anyway, so never mind. And along with treating female characters poorly, Rothfus is also crafting a story in which the protagonist is very much a Gary Stu, the male equivalent of a Mary Sue. He still outperforms everyone, is still exceptional in every way, and is still so great that he outperforms a literal fairy sex goddess in bed the first time he ever sleeps with someone. That's right, he's that good at sex despite being a complete virgin prior to that point. And after this book, I can definitely see why people say there are hints he may be an unreliable narrator, but it still irks me. So if none of those issues have changed or improved, why do I feel less inclined to trash this book? Well, because it helped me realize a bias I may still be having in my reading. You see, we've been taught and drilled that for a story to be good, the characters need to be well-rounded, vulnerable, average to an extent, human in some way. You need your characters to have a struggle and to overcome that struggle in order for the reader to be invested. Without this kind of character work, the reader will find no catharsis or joy at reading your story. Now, this isn't bad advice in the slightest, and I would often strictly follow this line of thinking in my own writing. But my mistake, and I think the majority of readers make the same mistake, my mistake was in believing that this is the only way of writing character, or at least the only good way, which basically means the only right way. I had completely forgotten and neglected a whole side of fantasy and the history of fantasy in favor for my own literature elitism. Rothfus is creating a story of a larger-than-life man achieving impossible things. He's writing the story of a legendary figure fallen from grace. Quoth is a man who became a living legend and who is now, in his own words, wallowing in the cut-flower silence of a man who is waiting to die. To ignore and discredit fantasy like Kingkiller would be to ignore key pillars that the genre was built on. The genre was filled with strong male protagonists that were larger than life and supermen in their own right. One of the most prevalent and well-known examples of this would be Conan the Barbarian from the early 50s to early 80s. Conan is the epitome of masculine energy being funneled into a superhuman character that can basically do no wrong. Women swoon before him and enemies cower at the mention of his name. Look even further back in the genre's history and you'll see further parallels. Beowulf is a prime example of how a powerful warrior king who had whole songs and ballads written to commemorate his incredible deeds with monsters and women. So I come to the realization that these stories still exist and are still being written. People still enjoy these stories of wish fulfillment and larger-than-life heroes they can insert themselves into. I mean, Rothfus has enough success with this series to show me that this is still a story type that people enjoy and want to see more of. And while I take issue with some aspects of these stories, I won't label them as good or bad. I am clearly not the intended audience for these kind of stories, but that doesn't make it a bad story or the people who dislike it any better than those who love it. It was a mistake of me to believe there were no other ways to write a story other than the way I do and I prefer. For the kind of story it is, the Kingkiller Chronicles are clearly masterfully done, and I can see that Rothfus is creating something very special here. And while it still isn't the kind of thing I enjoy the most, I can still see myself reading the third book when it comes out. And if Rothfus ever decides to write a different series, I would be more than willing to give it a try. And while I don't see how Rothfus will be able to answer all the major questions he set up in the third book, I believe that he could pull it off if he gives it his best try. He clearly has talent as an author, and I'm confident that if he gave it his all, he could pull it off without a hitch. The Wise Man's Fear is an overall improvement on the first book, and I commend Rothfus for achieving a stronger second book in a genre where second books are often the worst of the three in a trilogy. It genuinely widened my horizons and perspectives on the genre, and has helped me become a better and more well-rounded reader. Do I still have major problems with it despite that? Of course I do. But I also understand where Rothfus was coming from, and can thus better appreciate what he's trying to accomplish here. If you haven't read The Wise Man's Fear yet, but you've read Name of the Wind, I would recommend giving it a try. It's definitely a more enjoyable read, and at least worth finishing to give you a better understanding of the type of story it is compared to the first. In fact, it changed my mind so profoundly, I would actually question anyone who bashes Rothfus or the trilogy on whether or not they've actually finished the second book, because it makes that much of a difference to how one could perceive the story as a whole. But, as always guys, that has just been my opinion. I'd like to thank all of you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, I'd ask that you all consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. I'm currently trying to hit my goal of 1,000 subscribers, so please consider joining the community if you haven't yet. And to those who have already subscribed, thank you so much for your continued support. But like I always say, this has been Raven. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Take care everyone.